Chapter 36, the Cold War begins, 1945-1952. Let's get started. A few key points. The United States and the USSR emerge as superpowers after World War II, and they are going to be both competing directly and indirectly for influence in the post-war era. The text does say that they both wanted sort of like a continued expansion of their sphere of influence. At home, Americans see great economic prosperity for roughly 2 decades. But at the same time, this is sort of in the backdrop of this new nuclear era and a second Red Scare. So as we talked about going into World War II, there's a transition of the economy that has to occur, and this time it's going back to a peacetime economy, a consumer-based economy. And with that, a lot of the federal regulation that occurred during the war is going to end. So wartime price controls will be removed, which of course leads to increased prices. And there's also a trend of strikes that will occur beginning 1946. Speaking of labor, in 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act is passed, which outlawed the closed shop, meaning that all members of a particular business had to be union members. It also said that unions would be liable for damages that resulted from jurisdictional disputes amongst themselves, so financial liability, I'm assuming, as well as legal. And in addition to that, union leaders were required to take a non-communist oath, certainly a sign of this second Red Scare. But you can see on that line graph on the right there that after the war is over, there is a very brief recession that precedes economic growth. And that's because Uncle Sam is no longer purchasing all of the war supplies that were being purchased throughout the war. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, sort of the rival to the American Federation of Labor that was led by John L. Lewis, did have Operation Dixie, in which they tried to unionize Southern textile workers and steel workers. Actually failed in 1948 because it couldn't overcome fears of racial mixing. The Employment Act 1946 created a 3-member council of economic advisors to advise the president on policies regarding employment, production, and purchasing power. And the Servicemen's Readjustment Act 1944, also known as the GI Bill of Rights, or just the GI Bill, did make money available to send former World War II soldiers to school. This bill raised educational levels and stimulated the construction industry, which helped to create this economic expansion that started in the late 1940s. You see this here, postage stamp in top right of a former serviceman now back to school. Speaking of federal spending, the pageant tells us quite clearly that it was the increase in military spending that helped sustain economic growth, and that a lot of that had to do with the high technology industries, including aerospace and science, plastics and electronics. And now we also have a really nice, cheap, reliable source of petroleum from the Middle East. And we did talk about that a few chapters back about the American and British efforts to maintain the flow of oil, across the pond. But improved technology and the rising educational level of the workforce will increase productivity in general. And we'll talk about the GI Bill in a few slides here, but certainly that does the same thing in terms of providing education for people and thus elevating the type of work they can do. And this idea of technology and productivity spills over into the agricultural industry as well. Fewer farmers now can actually produce more crop. And so we'll see a continued trend away from farming as an occupation and lifestyle, but not a decline necessarily in farm production. Okay, so as I said, roughly 2 decades of economic growth. Americans will experience higher incomes. The middle class will expand. The standard of living will increase for many or most. Americans globally will account for 40% of the planet's wealth, and this will have a big impact on politics and society, something we'll come back to in a little while here. Many of the new jobs do go to women after the war, and the majority of jobs will be service jobs. And so we see a real shift in that away from manufacturing and away from agriculture, as I said on the previous slide, and now to a more modern American lifestyle or workforce of a service-based economy. You can see here that incomes grew really at all levels for the top and the bottom, and obviously this is also indicative of that uneven distribution of wealth, but I like this graph because it shows you that all Americans really are benefiting throughout this time. And you can see here from this that government spending certainly is going to be outpaced now by personal consumption expenditures between 1944 and 1947. Something I said a few slides back, that federal spending in the economy just sort of is just declining. So in the post-war era, there is a move to the suburbs, and the efforts of the Federal Housing Administration, Veterans Administration also will make that much more economical and therefore appealing. In fact, we start to see a shift in what Americans value and where they would like to live, and the city becomes less appealing, generally speaking, than the suburbs. Of course, this has a very big impact on the construction industry as many developments are being built, and I'll show you a Levittown in a second here. But the text also tells us that we experience this white flight in which wealthier Americans, who were more often than not white Americans, left these inner city locations for the suburbs. The pageant also suggests that the FHA refused blacks home mortgages for private home purchases, which was indicative of racial barriers in this country, but obviously limited black mobility. Here's an overhead view of a Levittown, the first of which was built in Long Island. These were basically affordable homes because they were built sort of with the assembly line structure. Um, and while this may look overwhelming, I happen to know quite a few people who grew up in the 50s and 60s in these types of neighborhoods, and they all tend to say the same thing. They say that it was a very exciting time to be a child because if each of these homes has three or four kids, or perhaps more with this baby boom that we experienced, then there was always somebody to play with. And I think that's kind of optimistic and kind of fun at the same time. Here you have sort of a brochure for the Levittown homes. You had roughly 4 or 5 floor plans to choose from and 4 or 5 roof lines to choose from. And you could kind of make any combination you wanted to, but you were left with a very affordable home that was yours. Population mobility will result from economic growth, and the largest region of growth will be the Sun Belt, and I'll show you a map of that in a second here. But the text said that it was no longer the Snow Belt in the Northeast or the Rust Belt in the Ohio Valley region, but it was the southern part of the country, which saw a lot of new jobs. It had the better climate. It had lower taxes. It had more federal funding coming to it than other regions of the country. And here is that Sun Belt right there. I happen to know Arizona, for example, is still growing at a very high rate today. A lot of people want to move to warmer weather. Right now, I'm thinking I'd like to move to warmer weather too, as we're experiencing more snow in March. I mean, come on, it's March. All right, folks born between 1945 and 1960 are considered baby boomers, and you can see from this photo that this must have been a very rambunctious household, to say the least. But this population obviously is going to be moving throughout their time together, and so as they grow up, they always have a profound impact on the world around them and on American society around them. Think of sort of like the social activists of the late 1960s, and think of Social Security today, which we're still trying to figure out how to pay for this swell in the population. You can see here some numbers, some statistics to show that birth rates were in fact higher from 1945 through 1960. And compare that to sort of this post-Great Recession era, beginning in 2007, where you can see that Americans are having fewer babies. And the obvious reason why is because of the financial responsibility associated with kids. If you're experiencing great economic times, then it becomes easier to have more children, especially if you only have one parent who is working, whereas in the modern world, we typically have a dual income family structure. Truman was the first president in quite some time to not have a college degree. He was a war veteran and an avid reader of history, but they said that he was just less educated, relatively speaking, than other presidents around him. They also called him the average man's average man. He was said to have met challenge with great courage. So back in February of 1945, the Big Three, and again that's Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, had met in Yalta to discuss the war's end at the Yalta Conference, and there were plans made for the occupation of Germany. It was also agreed that Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania would have free elections. That's an agreement that Stalin eventually backed out of. And the United Nations was discussed. Of course, that's going to have lasting impact on global affairs. There's some controversy regarding the decision in the Far East, and in a nutshell, Stalin agreed to attack Japan after the collapse of Germany, and in return, the Soviets were given territory in the Pacific. But they also, as a result of that, had control over some vital industries in China. And again, so you can see the sort of competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, the agreements that they made were not really binding. Instead, it said in the text that it was a way for the big three to sort of discuss general post-war plans and gauge each other's reactions. So really the focal point here is this uneasy relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And in 1945, the U.S. had terminated the USSR's much-needed Lend-Lease aid. It also ignored Moscow's plea for a $6 billion reconstruction loan, while at the same time it approved a similar loan of $3.75 billion to Great Britain in 1946. Now, the USSR, as I said earlier, were looking to extend and create a sphere of influence around it, which is, again, sort of a surrounding set of friendly countries, a buffer between the Soviet Union and the non-Soviet territories. But this, of course, contradicts with FDR's very Wilsonian dream of an open world, a decolonized, demilitarized, and democratized world. And so each country believed in this idea of universal expanse of its own form of government, and this will result in a 40-year standoff and competition that we just call the Cold War, which both countries were seeking to extend their influence. Just so you can see here, the Soviet Union and sort of its satellite nations, its sphere of influence here, the buffer between sort of the East and the West with Poland, Romania, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. All right, there's another meeting at Bretton Woods in 1944 in which the International Monetary Fund was created, and it encouraged world trade by regulating currency exchange rates. Also at Bretton Woods, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, a World Bank, was created to promote economic growth in underdeveloped areas. And the USA took the lead in organizing and funding this, and the Soviets declined to participate. All right, let's talk about the UN real quick. In April of 1945, 50 countries sent representatives to San Francisco to write the United Nations Charter. And it kind of creates a two-house structure, so to say. We have the Security Council, which is dominated by the big five countries. It's going to be the U.S., Great Britain, the USSR, France, and China. And they have veto power, by the way. And then there's the General Assembly, in which all other nations that participate can send a representative to. And so, again, it allows smaller countries to have a larger influence in the General Assembly than they do, say, for example, with the Security Council. This time around, the Senate overwhelmingly passed the document, and we officially joined the United Nations in the summer of 1945. Unlike the League of Nations, will be a very large, a leader within this organization. There are several sub-organizations within the UN that have great influence globally, and they work to pass resolutions to address issues worldwide. Obviously, in this post-World War II era, there's a real concern about nuclear weapons. In 1946, Bernard Baruch wanted to create a UN agency free from the great veto power with worldwide authority over atomic energy, atomic weapons, and atomic research. The plan fell apart, though, as neither the United States nor the Soviet Union wanted to give up their nuclear weapons. Again, so it's like this uneasy relationship, and the overall goal of disarmament, but the fear of putting oneself in a position of risk. All right, so before the U.S. even joined World War II, don't forget Churchill and FDR met and signed the Atlantic Charter. They agreed that Nazi Germany should be defeated, but that Germany as a people and a country should be restored. In fact, the pageant says that the United States recognized that a flourishing German economy would help all of Europe, but also the U.S. Now, it said the Soviets felt differently, that they feared another German-initiated war, and that might have something to do with the extremely high casualties the Soviets faced throughout World War II. It may have other factors involved as well. But it was decided that Austria and Germany would be divided into 4 military occupation zones. Each of those would be assigned to one of the big four powers, as you can see there. And I'll show you a map of that in a second. The USSR denied post-war economic support from the USA, and they wanted to take reparations from Germany, something that already failed after the First World War. And you can see that the British, American, and French occupation zones are on the western side. Eventually, they'll be consolidated into one West Germany, and the Soviets will retain East Germany. But also within East Germany, you can see that Berlin is located there. And so Berlin will also be divided into 4 occupation zones as well. Quite complicated. So as I said earlier, the Soviets are going to look to spread communism to its eastern German zone, and the Western allies are promoting democracy and democratization of the region, and they are actually advocating for reunification. But that's just not going to happen. We're going to have a West Germany, which is more democratic, more independent, and you have East Germany, which is going to be another one of these satellite nations that's sort of hidden behind the Iron Curtain of the Soviet Union. Berlin, as I said, was completely surrounded by the Soviet occupation zone, and in 1948, the Soviet Union actually blockaded Berlin. And so the Allies are left with a difficult situation. Like, do you send the tanks in to open up the doors to Berlin? How do you proceed without provoking another or a continuation of this conflict? And so what results is the Berlin airlift. And for roughly a year, you can see American and British planes are going to be flying supplies virtually nonstop to Berlin to help the people who are being shut off. The Soviets lifted the blockade as a result of this, and the crisis was avoided. 1946, Stalin, who was seeking oil concessions, broke an agreement to remove his troops from Iran's northernmost province. Those troops were actually used to aid in a rebel movement, and Harry Truman protested this, and Stalin backed down. But again, this is sort of indicative, alongside the division of Germany and the Berlin airlift, that this Cold War is really sort of taken off. 1947, George Kennan came up with this idea of the containment doctrine, which tried to explain that we need to keep communism where it is, that the Soviets would be relentlessly expansionary in their nature, and we need to be firm and vigilant and not necessarily remove communism, but prevent its expansion. 1947, the Truman Doctrine embraced this idea of containment, and what it did was it pledged to financially support Greece against communism. And in fact, Truman declared that it must be the policy of the U.S. to aid any country that was resisting communist aggression. And so again, we often see sort of the idea of free peoples fighting off, a tyrannical minority or an outside pressure, and the U.S. going to come to the aid of that, in this case financially. Continuing with financial contributions of the U.S. into the post-war era, we have the Marshall Plan, which gave $12.5 billion to 16 European countries, which within a few years, the European economy was flourishing again, and communist parties within those countries had lost a lot of ground. Now, a lot of this growth is contingent upon access to Middle Eastern oil, and despite the threats from several Arab nations to cut off the supply of oil, President Truman officially recognized the State of Israel on May 14, 1948. Here you can see a graph of countries which received aid under the Marshall Plan, and if you had to guess which countries received the most aid, you could probably get it right, that it's our traditional allies in the UK and France, as you can see there, but other countries as well, of course, are receiving aid. And I'd like to hit this cartoon in class. If you want to pause the video, go ahead and do that now. Now, while the Cold War does not involve any direct fighting between the Soviets and the USA, it certainly is very militaristic in nature, and it is a struggle to arm, and it's a struggle to keep tabs on one another and streamline sort of military operations in general. In 1947, the National Security Act is passed, and it creates the Department of Defense, which is going to be led by the Secretary of Defense, and it will bring together the heads of the various military branches, which is known as the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and also establish a National Security Council to advise the President on security matters. And it created the Central Intelligence Agency, which you can see their seal on the bottom right-hand side. And you can see Farewell Washington is the title of this slide, and what we mean here is sort of Washington's advice to stay out of entangling alliances and so forth. In 1948, the United States joins the European Pact of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and this is a pact which pledges each nation to regard an attack on one as an attack on all. And while this boosts European unification, it's a significant step in the militarization of the Cold War. Take a look at the map here. You can see NATO, and what will result from that is a Soviet pact called the Warsaw Pact. Doesn't exist just yet, 1948. But if you look closely, you'll see the North Pole is in the center of this map, and so it's an overhead shot. But it's quite a large alliance system that results, and as I said before, an end to American isolationism. So General MacArthur took control of the democratization of Japan, and the Japanese people cooperated with his plans as they saw that good behavior and the adoption of democracy would speed the end of occupation. 1946, a MacArthur-dictated constitution was adopted, and it renounced militarism and introduced Western-style democratic government. 1946-1948, Japanese war criminals were tried in Tokyo. In late 1949, the Chinese nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, and Mao Zedong, the communist Mao Zedong, took over the country. When the communists did take over China, 1/4 of the world's population fell to communism. Speaking of an arms race, a nuclear arms race is a major component of this Cold War. In 1949, the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb, and as a result of that, Truman ordered the development of the H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb, and that was first detonated by the Americans in 1952, and in the following year, the Soviets followed suit. Now, people could buy these prefabbed bomb shelters to place in the backyard, and really is sort of a sign of this Cold War nuclear culture. All right, so there's a real push to, sort of fight back against threats of communism at home. In 1947, Truman created the Loyalty Review Board to investigate the possibility of communist spies in the government. Getting back to 1940, we have the Smith Act on the books, which was the first peacetime anti-sedition law since 1798, And in 1949, 11 communists were sent to prison, which was upheld in Dennis v. U.S. in 1951. In 1938, the House of Reps established the Committee on Un-American Activities, and they investigated subversion or opposition to the government, including subliminal messaging, perhaps in Hollywood. And here is Ronald Reagan, who cooperated as president of the Screen Actors Guild. He cooperated in the investigations that perhaps there was communists in Hollywood. Another friendly witness was Walt Disney, who also cooperated. Both of these men went on to have very successful careers in their own right, obviously. But there were 10 other Hollywood actors who did not actually cooperate, and they went to prison. Now, Richard Nixon is going to emerge as a congressman who is known for being tough on communists, and his efforts led to the conviction of Alfred Hiss, a prominent ex-New Dealer who was said to have given atomic secrets to the Soviets. In 1950, Congress overrode Truman's veto of the McCarran Internal Security Bill, which authorized the president to arrest and detain suspicious people during an internal security emergency. Maybe the most famous case, though, of Soviet spies or alleged Soviet spies would be the Rosenbergs. In 1951, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were convicted and sentenced to death for stealing American atomic bomb plans and selling them to the Soviet Union. They were linked to this Soviet spy ring. Here's a photo of them. I think her face says quite a lot there. Now, 1948 is a presidential election year, and the Republicans will run Tom Dewey, and the Democrats will nominate Truman. Now, this actually splits the Democratic Party. Southern Democrats will oppose Truman because he supports civil rights, and they nominate a states' writer and Governor J. Strom Thurmond. There's also a new Progressive Party, which nominated Henry A. Wallace. Now, anytime a party splits, usually the other party wins, but that's not going to happen this time. In fact, Truman wins because of the votes of farmers, of workers, and African Americans. And here's the iconic photo of Harry Truman holding up a newspaper. The paper had printed the headline a bit early, as you can see here, because Dewey did not defeat Truman. Here is the election map. You can see here that with the popular vote, Truman has roughly 3 million more votes than the next candidate. He also has 57% of the electoral vote. So remember, Truman did take over for FDR the first time, and now he's reelected. And so we talk about some of his ideas. First of all, abroad, he has a bold new program, or what is known as the Point 4 program, in which American money would be lent to help countries develop before they fell to communism. Domestically, he's offering a fair deal, improving housing, full employment, higher minimum wage, better farm prices, new efforts of TVAs, for example, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and an extension of Social Security. Congress did not pass legislation for farm prices or TVAs, but did support the other initiatives. They also passed the Housing Act 1949 and expanded Social Security in 1950. After Japan collapsed in 1945, Korea was divided up into two sections. The 38th parallel, the line of latitude, will be dividing between North Korea and South Korea. The United States would control south of that line. The Soviets would have control north of that line. Now, the National Security Council Memorandum number 68, NSC 68, was a document created by the National Security Council that outlined America's national security strategy, and it called for quadrupling military spending and using the containment policy in regards to the Soviet Union. This is a key document of the Cold War because it marked a major step in the militarization of American foreign policy, and is committing itself to sort of containment and defending South Korea. And here is that line of latitude. You can see those lines of advancement, which we'll talk about here in the next slide, of North Korean invasion and the UN offensive, as well as the Chinese response to that. Now, in June of 1950, the North Korean army invaded South Korea, and in response to this, Truman ordered a massive military buildup well beyond what was actually necessary for the Korean War. Without Congress's approval, Truman ordered American air and naval units to be sent to support South Korea, and the UN was responsible for sending troops to fight North Koreans, but generally speaking, it was led by an American and General MacArthur, and most of the troops were American. Now, September 15, 1950, MacArthur pushed North Koreans past the 38th parallel, so into North Korea. And on November 1950, thousands of Chinese communist volunteers attacked the UN forces, pushing them back to the 38th parallel. Now, due to MacArthur's insubordination and disagreement with the Joint Chiefs of Staff about increasing the size of the war, Truman was forced to remove MacArthur from command April 11, 1951. He returns as a hero, and there's some conflict, obviously, between MacArthur and Truman as a result of that. But in 1951, in July of 1951, truce discussions began, but they will drag on for 2 years after that. In the end, we see the boundary restored, and we see sort of a stalemate in Korea. Well, that's it for Chapter 36. We are now into Period 8, which is very promising and exciting for sure. We've got about 2 months before the big test there in May, so keep working hard. If you have any questions, please feel free to email and let me know in class. Take care.